I think I'll probably start the YouTube video around here. Hi everybody, welcome to chapters 5 and 6 of Capitalist Realism by Mark Fisher. I've already read all of the ones up to here, the chapters thus far. Check it out on my YouTubes. And yeah, we just finished this chapter 4, which was about, young people at uni being demotivated and disconnected, which Mark Fisher's said a bunch of really boomery shit about, but also, he's a teacher at a uni and probably knows at least a little bit about what he's saying. So let's get stuck in with chapter 5. October 6th, 1979. Don't let yourself get attached to anything. A guy told me one time, says organized crime boss Neil Macaulay in Michael Mann's 1995 film Heat. Don't let yourself get attached to anything you're not willing to walk out on in 30 seconds flat if you feel the heat around the corner. One of the easiest ways to grasp the differences between Fordism and post-Fordism is to compare Mann's film with the gangster movies made by Francis Ford Coppola and Martin Scorsese between 1971 and 1990. I love this extremely Žižekian approach of we're going to talk about some really abstract political, psychological stuff, and how are we going to do that? Well, let's talk about gangster films for an unreasonably long amount of time. It's a very Žižek move. In Heat, the scores are undertaken not by families with links to the old country, but by rootless crews in an LA of polished chrome and interchangeable designer kitchens, of featureless freeways and late-night diners. All the local the cuisine aromas, the cultural idiolects which the likes of The Godfather and Goodfellas depended upon, have been painted over and refitted. Also reminds me of The Wire. There's kind of this conflict between cultural gangsters and businessmen who do crime or something. Anyway. Heat's Los Angeles is a world without landmarks, a branded sprawl, where markable territory has been replaced by endlessly repeating vistas of replicating franchises. Yeah, maybe like the difference between The Sopranos and The Wire. The ghosts of old Europe that stalked Scorsese and Coppola's streets have been exorcised. Coppola's streets have been exorcised, buried with the ancient beefs, bad blood, and burning vendettas somewhere beneath the multinational coffee shops. You can learn a great deal from the world of Heat. About the world of Heat from considering the name Neil Macaulay. It's an anonymous name, a fake passport name, a name that's bereft of history, even as, ironically, it echoes the name of the British historian Lord Macaulay. Compare Corleone, and remember that The Godfather was named after a village. Macaulay is perhaps the part that De Niro played that is closest to the actor's own personality. A screen, a cipher, depthless, icily professional, stripped down to pure preparation, research, method. I do what I do best. Macaulay is no mafia boss, no puffed-up chief perched atop a baroque hierarchy governed by codes as solemn and mysterious as those of the Catholic Church, and written in the bloods of 1,000 feuds. His crew are professionals, hands-on entrepreneur speculators, crime technicians, whose credo is the exact opposite of Cosa Nostra family loyalty. Family ties are unsustainable in these conditions, as Macaulay tells the Pacino character, the driven detective Vincent Hanna. Now, if you're on me, and you gotta move when I move, how do you expect to keep a marriage? Hannah is Macaulay's shadow, forced to assume his insubstantiality, his perpetual mobility. Like any group of shareholders, Macaulay's crew is held together by the prospect of future revenue. Any other bonds are optional extras, almost certainly dangerous. Their arrangement is temporary, pragmatic, and lateral. They know that they are interchangeable machine parts, that there are no guarantees, that nothing lasts. Compared to this, the Goodfellas seem like sedentary sentimentalists, rooted in dying communities, doomed territories. Interesting. I've seen barely any of these films that he's talking about, but I think he explains it quite nicely anyway. The ethos espoused by Macaulay is the one which Richard Sennett examines in The Corrosion of Character, the personal consequences of work in the new capitalism. Oh, it sounds upsetting. A landmark study of the effective changes that the post-Fordist reorganization has brought about. The slogan which sums up the new conditions is, no long term. Where formerly workers could acquire a single set of skills and expect to progress upwards through a rigid organizational hierarchy, now they're required to periodically reskill as they move from institution to institution, from role to role. As the organization of work is decentralized, with lateral networks replacing pyramidal hierarchies, a premium is put on flexibility. Echoing Macaulay's mockery of Hannah in Heat, how do you expect to keep a marriage? Sennett emphasizes the intolerable stresses that these conditions of permanent instability put on family life. The values that family life depend upon, obligation, trustworthiness, commitment, are precisely those which are held to be obsolete in the new capitalism. Yet with the public sphere under attack and the safety nets that a nanny state used to provide being dismantled, the family becomes an increasingly important place of respite from the pressures of a world in which instability is a constant. Okay? So in this study, permanent instability puts stress on people. The obligations that family life depend on, obligation, trustworthiness, commitment, are precisely those which are held to be obsolete. That makes sense. So when he's talking about like the new gangsters or whatever, there's no obligation, trustworthiness, or commitment. They're all, what does he say? Temporary, pragmatic, and lateral. They know they're interchangeable machine parts. I think that's a nice analogy. The family becomes an increasingly important place of respite, right, which also makes sense. Like you go home from work to be not at work with your family. The situation of the family in post-Fordist capitalism is contradictory in precisely the way that traditional Marxism expected. Capitalism requires the family as an essential means of reproducing and caring for labor power, as a salve for the psychic wounds inflicted by anarchic social-economic conditions, even as it undermines it, denying parents time with children, putting intolerable stress on couples as they become the exclusive sort of effective consolation for each other. Amen. I like this. It kind of reminds me of like Deleuze and Guattari talk a lot about redoubling, of like something happening and then the same thing happening sort of to itself or something. It also reminds me of the Marxist, what's it called? Exchange value. Yeah, totally. Yeah. You're a good capitalist. Difference between like exchange value and use value. Like the family has this exchange value as an essential means for reproducing and caring for labor power, and it also has a use value. It's the salve for wounds, which I think is interesting, because Marx, one of his big complaints, obviously, about capitalism is the way that everything suddenly is interpreted through exchange value. But I think in modern capitalism, it's like deeply inappropriate to like comment on the way in which family has an exchange value or something, this social reproduction or whatever. Anyway. According to Marxist economist Christian Marazzi, the switch from Fordism to post-Fordism can be given a very specific date, October 6th, 1979. It was on that date that the Federal Reserve increased interest rates by 20 points, preparing the way for the supply-side economics that would constitute the economic reality in which we're now situated. Enmeshed. I don't know why I put in a completely different word there. But this is obviously... Again, he's writing in 2009, I think, when the global financial crisis is in like full swing. And I think since then we've had like the coronavirus, which has really changed the economic reality in which we're enmeshed. Yeah, I don't really know anything about Bourdieu. Bourdieu, whatever. There's too many French philosophers with similar names. The rise in interest rates not only contained inflation, i.e. making loans feasible, it made possible a new organization of the means of production and distribution. Yeah, that's a good idea. The rigidity of the Fordist production line gave way to a new flexibility. A word that will... Oh, sorry. Yeah. A word that will send chills of recognition down the spine of every worker today. This flexibility was defined by a deregulation of the capital and labor, with the workforce being casualized with an increasing number of workers employed on a temporary basis and outsourced. Like Sennett, Marazzi recognizes that the new conditions both required and emerged from an increased cybernetization of the working environment. So I think this is a technical term when people talk about cybernetics in like post-leftist philosophy. I think what it normally means is a series of interlocking positive feedback loops that like communicate with one another in various ways. So there's like a system that controls itself. Classic example is like a boiler that, like, when it gets too hot, like, opens a valve so that the pressure reduces. Like, a pressure valve is, like, a really fundamental model for cybernetics, but I don't really understand that. There's a podcast, what's it called? Oops, cybernetics podcast. No. Yeah, this is it. General Intellect Unit, GIU. Definitely check them out. Whoops, what's going on? Please don't dox myself, Noon. Yeah, check it out. General Intelligence Unit. They're really good. They do a lot of, like, cybernetic analysis of people like Mark Fisher. The Fordist factory was crudely divided into blue and white collar work, with the different types of labor physically delimited by the structure of the building itself. Laboring in noisy environments, watched over by managers and supervisors, workers had access to language only in their breaks. Wow, brutal. In the toilet and at the end of the working day, or when they were engaged in sabotage, because communication interrupted production. But in post-Fordism, when the assembly line became a flux of information, people work by communicating. As Norbert Wiener taught, communication and control entail one another. So again, this is him basically explaining the concept of cybernetics, right? Is that there's like workplaces have a flux of information. Glory holes for blue-collar workers. Amen. That's the dream. That's what the unions should be calling for. Work and life become inseparable. Capital follows you when you dream. I mean, surely this happened pre-capitalist workers, right? Like shepherds or whatever. Like, surely they dreamed about sheep all the time. Anyway. Time ceases to be linear, becomes chaotic, broken down into punctiform divisions. As production and distribution are restructured, so are nervous systems. To function effectively as a component of just-in-time production, you must develop a capacity to respond to unforeseen events. You must learn to live in conditions of total instability, or precarity, as the ugly neologism has it. Periods of work alternate with periods of unemployment. Typically, you find yourself employed in a series of short-term jobs, unable to plan for the future. So, welcome people who've just rocked up. We are reading Capitalist Realism, Chapter 5, currently. And I believe he's mainly talking about ways that unions could organize for a post-Fordist world and, like, find different ways of protesting on behalf of their workers other than, like, pay rates and, like, better working conditions or whatever. And we're going in a fairly indirect route there, but we seem to be finally getting to that point. Yeah. Both Marazzi and Sennett point out that the disintegration of stable working patterns... Oh yeah, Stalinism, hell yeah. Don't quote me on that. Both Marazzi and Sennett point out that the disintegration of stable working patterns was in part driven by the desires of workers. It was they who, quite rightly, did not wish to work in the same factory for 40 years. In many ways, the left has never recovered from being wrong-footed by capital's mobilization and metabolization of the desire for emancipation from Fordist routine. Again, I think this is super relevant in the, like, post-working from home era. Like, everyone was working from home, and there was this, like, brief moment where I felt like everyone had, like, joined me in my lifestyle. Everyone was like, oh, wow, it turns out my job is, like, pointless nonsense, and, like, I actually have to do, like, approximately 45 minutes of work a day, and then I could just be, like, living a nice life the rest of the time. But working from home kind of got caught up with the suffering of the pandemic, which, like, makes sense. I'm not saying that unrelated, but, like, they don't have to be. And now there's this, like, oh, please let me go back to the office to a certain extent. Obviously, not everyone wants to go back, and there's, like, fights about that. But I think this is a similar kind of thing where capital, like, mobilized and metabolized the possibility of working from home as, like, a radical change. And now it's not radical. Now it's, like, kind of conservative in some way. Anyway. Especially in the UK, the traditional representatives of the working class, union and labour leaders, found Fordism rather too congenial. Its stability of antagonism gave them a guaranteed role. But this meant it was easy for the advocates of post-Fordist capital to present themselves as the opponents of the status quo, bravely resisting an inertial organised labour pointlessly invested in fruitless ideological antagonism, which served the ends of union leaders and politicians, but did little to advance the hopes of the class they purportedly represented. I think this is just a very pretentious way of, like, complaining about professional unionism. Antagonism is now not located externally, in the face-off between class blocks, but internally, in the psychology of the worker, who, as a worker, is interested in old-style class conflict, but as someone with a pension fund, is also interested in maximizing the yield from his or her investments. Makes sense, especially the bit where the work-from-home debate excludes massive sectors of the economy. See also the 4-day work week, which is a great way to split the works if you don't explain it right. Yeah, totally. It's a good point. And, like, the Morrison government, like, basically decided that, like, women should be unemployed and stay home to do caring, and also that everyone in the early childhood sector needed to work without any support. So they, like, really, I mean, we talked about this all the time on the podcast, but, like, they really, like, put the onus of the pandemic on women, and specifically working women. There's no longer an identifiable external enemy. The consequence is, Marazzi argues, that post-Fordist workers are like the Old Testament Jews after they left the house of slavery. Very, very relevant. It's Passover this week. It's the story of this. Liberated from a bondage to which they have no wish to return, but also abandoned, stranded in the desert, confused about the way forward. I don't have my Bible on hand, but there's a bit shortly after they leave Egypt where the Israelites turn to Moses, and they're like, Moses, could we go back to Egypt? At least there we were, like, being beaten in our house, where we had a house and food. Now we're in the fucking desert, and we're just gonna die without a house. Yeah. The psychological conflict raging within individuals cannot but have casualties. It's a nice sentence. Marazzi is researching the link between the increase in bipolar disorder and post-Fordism, and if, as Deleuze and Guattari argue, schizophrenia is the condition that marks the outer edges of capitalism, then bipolar disorder is the mental illness proper to the interior of capitalism. With its ceaseless boom and bust cycles, capitalism is itself fundamentally and irreducibly bipolar, periodically lurching between hyped-up mania, the irrational exuberance of bubble thinking, and depressive come-down. The term economic depression is no accident, of course. To a degree unprecedented in any other social system, capitalism both feeds on and reproduces the moods of populations. Without delirium and confidence, capital could not function. It seems that with post-Fordism, the invisible plague of psychiatric and affective disorders that has spread silently and stealthily since 1750, i.e. the very onset of industrial capitalism, has reached a new level of acuteness. Here, Oliver James's work is important. In The Selfish Capitalist, James points to significant rises in the rates of mental distress over the last 25 years. By most criteria, James reports, rates of distress almost doubled between people born in 1946, age 36 and 92, and 1970. For example, 16% of 36-year-old women in 1982 reported having trouble with nerves, feeling low, depressed, or sad, whereas 29% of 30-year-olds reported this in 2000. For men, it was 8% and 13%. That's pretty significant. Another British study which James cites compared levels of psychiatric morbidity, which includes neurotic symptoms, phobias, and depression, in samples of people in 1977-1985, whereas 22% of the earlier sample reported psychiatric morbidity. This has risen to almost a third of the population by 1986. Since it's not that I necessarily disagree with this, like, they've done the studies, I haven't, but it reminds me of some remark that I think he made in the previous chapter, where he says something like, mental illness as such is, like, new and unique to capitalism, and, like, maybe that's true. I think that there's a lot to be said for that, and, like, this whole book is basically making that argument. There's sort of, like, a qualitative and quantitative change between mental illness pre-capital and post-capital, but you got to assume that, like, again, I'm just going to shepherds because I've been reading a bunch of Jewish stuff, but, like, surely a bunch of shepherds were horribly depressed, Man, I wish they'd let women write influential theories. Still reeling from the Germaine Greer being the only woman in the philosophy section. Yeah, that's rough. That is rough. Okay, since these rates are much higher in countries that have implemented what James calls selfish capitalism than in other capitalist nations, James hypothesizes that it's selfish, i.e. neoliberalized capitalist policies and culture that are to blame. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And, like, Foucault, also, hey, what up, Given Durant? Thanks for jumping in. Foucault obviously, like, does a lot of work tracing mental illness and the approaches towards it throughout history, and, like, ties it to leper boats and all this other stuff, workhouses. I would bet good money that Mark Fisher has read Madness and Civilization a few times. Yeah, expulsion and then later imprisonment, yeah. Specifically, James points to the way in which selfish capitalism stokes up both aspirations and the expectations that they can be fulfilled. This is just the logic of desire, though, right? This is just Lacan. In the entrepreneurial fantasy society, the delusion is fostered that anyone can be Alan Sugar or Bill Gates. Never mind that the actual likelihood of this occurring has diminished since the 1970s. A person born in 1958 was more likely than one born in 1970 to achieve upward mobility through education, for example. Hey, Willem, what's up? Why are we reading? Do it every morning. Friday morning, Philosophy Fridays. Read a bit of whatever I'm interested in at the moment. I'm doing Mark Fisher's Capitalist Realism. Reading is good for you. Though, as he points out in the previous chapter, it doesn't matter what the content is. Reading is fundamentally boring. Yeah, agree. Given to rant. That's a good point. I'm probably not actually going to game today a game of Will to stay sober. That massively reduces the appeal of staring at a map for 4 hours, but we'll see how we go. Where do we get up to? Yeah, the selfish capitalist toxins are that are most poisonous to well-being are the systematic encouragement of the ideas that material affluence is the key to fulfillment, that only the affluent are winners, and that access to the top is open to anyone willing to work hard enough, regardless of their familial, ethnic, or social background. If you don't succeed, there's only one person to blame. James's conjectures about aspirations, expectations, and fantasy fit with my own observations of what I've called hedonic depression in British youth. It's telling, in this context of rising rates of mental illness, that New Labour committed itself early in its third term in government to removing people from the incapacity benefit. I assume that's like disability support pension in Australia. Yeah, bloody Protestants making me stay sober. Implying that many, if not most, claimants are malingerers. What up? In contrast with this assumption, it doesn't seem unreasonable to infer that most of the people claiming incapacity benefit, and there are well in excess of 2 million of them, are casualties of capital. Yeah, I know, it's such an outdated series of points that he's making, but they're also like, you know, the ghost of neoliberalism is still haunting us today. A significant proportion of claimants, for instance, are people psychologically damaged as a consequence of the capitalist realist insistence that industries such as mining are no longer economically viable. Even considered in brute economic terms, though, the arguments about viability seem rather less than convincing, especially once you factor in the cost to the taxpayers of incapacity and other benefits. That's a good point. But what if you just cut benefits, Mark? You didn't think of that. Many have simply buckled under the terrifying unstable conditions of post-Fordism. Pardon me. The current ruling ontology denies any possibility of social causation of mental illness. The chemico-biologization, it's a good word, of mental illness is of course strictly commensurate with its depoliticization. Considering mental illness an individual, and again, this is just like a straight Foucauldian point, right? That by making something like scientific, we move it out of the realm of like ideology or politics. It's a very Žižekian point as well. Considering mental illness as an individual biochemical problem has enormous benefits for capitalism. First, it reinforces capital's drive towards atomistic individualization. You're sick because of your brain chemistry. Second, it provides an enormously lucrative market in which multinational pharmaceutical companies can peddle their pharmaceuticals. We can cure you with our SSRIs. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly the point, Willem. So Foucault is going on and on about, like, we have this idea that like crazy people get put in institutions to be cared for, but then if you look at historically, it's actually like anyone who's not working gets put in workhouses, and then later we like decide that crazy is one of those types of people. If someone is like a child, then they're not a good worker and we send them to school. If someone does crimes, they're a bad worker and we send them to jail. If someone's crazy, then they're not a good worker and we send them to hospital, etc., etc. Yeah. And Zizek says that like the most ideological thing is that precisely which we're made to treat as non-political, right? Like beg buttons. That's also true. That's also true. Yeah. It goes without saying that all mental illnesses are neurologically instantiated. Does it? Does it, Mark? I did a whole philosophy degree about this. But that says nothing about their causation. If it's true, for example, that depression is constituted by low serotonin levels, that what still needs to be explained is why particular individuals have low levels of serotonin. This requires a social and political explanation, and the task of repoliticizing mental illness is an urgent one if the left wants to challenge capitalist realism. It does not seem fanciful to see parallels between the rising incidence of mental distress and new patterns of assessing workers' performance. We'll now take a closer look at this new bureaucracy. All that is solid melts into PR. It's chapter 6 coming up. I'm not going to take a 2-minute break. I'm just going to sip my coffee and ruminate for a moment. And we'll move on. Something I find a bit difficult with political philosophy, nice, in general, is that often it really feels like they're making a clear point, and then you get to the end and you're like, okay, so what did you tell me to do here? I think Mark Fisher, like, what is he advocating for? I'm sure he's getting to it. I remember that he has some, like, proposals later in the book. But what would this mean, right? Like, does it mean stop going to therapy and taking your antidepressants? Because I don't think so. Like, I don't think, like, he's clearly comfortable with the idea that antidepressants might help or something. No, it's not just a you problem. It's, like, a massive issue. Like, Deleuze and Guattari are real fucking nuisances about it as well. Like, everyone. Zizek explicitly refuses to make suggestions. And so whenever I'm reading Zizek, I'm like on the lookout for like, is he heavily suggesting that we do something here? But I think Mark Fisher probably wants basically like unions to be like, we are now the mentally ill union, and we're now the anti-bureaucracy union, or something like that. I thought of like the first time I read this, I was like, what if we made a political party oriented around like stress and depression? The sad party, stressed and depressed party. I don't know if that would get much traction, but yeah. Just on the note of sipping coffee while we're in this little interlude, there's a joke in Go, the board game, that there's like all of these, a few moves that are like always super obvious. You just like 100% of the time you play this move, and there's a joke about yes, this move needs you to take a sip of tea and pretend you're thinking about it before you play it. I think they're called sip of tea moves or something like that. Yes, I agree, Willem. That's a good point given Tarrant. Like, there's a little bit of like tenants union is kind of in the similar thing, but like, yeah, I think a patients union is a great idea. Yeah, totally. Yep. All right, well, let's keep going and see what he says about Stalin and bureaucracy. Whew, a little bit of a wheeze. All that's solid melts into PR, market Stalinism, and bureaucratic anti-production. Mike Judge's unjustly under-celebrated film Office Space, 1999, is about as an acute account of the 90s, 2000s workplace as Schrader's Blue Collar was of 70s labor relations. Thanks, Mark. What a easy and relatable couple of movies that I've definitely seen and have compared before. I haven't seen any fucking films. It's really hard. And the funny thing about Zizek is he'll be like, you're all familiar with Alvin and the Chipmunks, or like the famous porn film Deep Throat or whatever, and then later he'll be like, and of course you're all familiar with the third aria from the second act of Der Zauberflaut. Yeah. Anyway, instead of the confrontation, well, apparently Mark Fisher does. Instead of the confrontation between trade union officials and management in a factory, Judge's film shows a corporation sclerotized, made into bone? Hardened by conversion to sclerotin. Sorry, you can't see that properly here. There you go. Whatever. Yeah, basically means like, yeah, made it hard like bone. Or chitin. By administrative anti-production. Workers receive multiple memos from different managers saying the exact same thing. Naturally, the memo concerns a bureaucratic practice. It aims to induce compliance with a new procedure of putting cover sheets on reports. In keeping with the being smart ethos, hard and slowly becoming more impossible. Sorry, what is hard and becoming more impossible? Oh, if something is sclerotized, that makes sense. In keeping with the being smart ethos, the management style in Office Space is a mixture of shirt-sleeveless informality and quiet authoritarianism. Judge shows the same managerialism presides in the corporate coffee chains, where the office workers go to relax. Here, staff are required to decorate their uniforms with 7 pieces of flair, i.e. badges or other personal tokens, to express their individuality and creativity. A handy illustration of the way in which creativity and self-expression have become intrinsic to labor and control societies, which, as Paulo Werner, Jan Mulya Boateng, a couple of good names there, and others have pointed out, now makes effective, well as productive demands on workers. So not only do you have to turn up and make coffee all day, you actually, you have to smile, like have a nice chat with all of the customers. There's this cafe in Sydney that I've been to once or twice called The Grumpy Barista. And its logo on the sign is just like this mustache. And you go in, and there's a barista there, like, looking really pissed off, and he's got exactly the same mustache. And I was like, great. This is great branding. And then another guy came up and he was like, hey, what's up? What can I get for you? And I like ordered, and the grumpy barista just like made it real grumpy. And I was like, this is hilarious. Like, what a good concept, having the grumpy barista and then also the charming guy who does the front of house stuff. What a good marketing technique. But it's still doing the same thing that Mark Fisher is complaining about here, right? Like, what if that barista's in a really good mood one day and he just wants to be like smiley and chatty, but he has to like performatively be grumpy? Yeah, exactly. Kevin Durant, yeah. The coffee was mediocre, so, you know. Furthermore, the attempt to crudely quantify these effective contributions also tells us a great deal about the new arrangements. The flair example also points to another phenomenon, hidden expectations behind official standards. Joanna, a waitress at the coffee chain, wears exactly 7 pieces of flair, but it's made clear to her that even though 7 is officially enough, it's actually inadequate. The manager asks if she wants to look the sort of person who only does the bare minimum. You know what, Stan, if you want to wear 37 pieces of flair, Joanna complains, why didn't you just make the minimum 37 pieces of flair? Well, the manager replies, I thought I remembered you saying that you wanted to express yourself. This is another classic Zizek bit. He talks about the modern anti-authoritarian father or something along those lines. I actually fucking hate his remark about it, but it is somewhat undeniable in some ways. But he basically says, back in the day, fathers used to be authority figures who would say something like, no, we're going to grandma's, I don't care if you're pissed off, you have to go and you have to be nice to her. And now, modern fathers don't say that. They say, like, it would really mean a lot to your mother if you went and visited your grandma because, you know, she loves you and you love her and she's not going to be around very long. And so, not only does the kid still have to do the same thing, but they have to pretend that they weren't being made to do that. And I think this is a very strictly homologous situation where there's, like, this official but actual distinction. Like, officially, it's your choice to go visit your grandma, but actually, you have to go, and you have to have a nice time. Yeah, that resonates for me. Though I like the coffee example better. Yeah, totally. Yeah, fucking yeah. Maybe that's why I hate it, because I'm like, well, just call me out more, why don't you? There was another thing here I wanted to say. Oh yeah, just this like official versus actual distinction reminds me a lot of the like symbolic real distinction. For Lacan, the real is that which resists symbolization entirely. And so there's this like symbolic injunction, you must wear 7 pieces of personality. But then when you do that, this little like problem arises where even though you can't say, well, you have to wear more than 7, actually you do have to wear more than 7. Like, the real of the situation is that you have to express your individuality yourself. Like, you can't follow the rules about it. You have to go above and beyond. Anyway, enough is no longer enough. This syndrome will be familiar to many workers who may find that a satisfactory grading and performance evaluation is no longer satisfactory. Yep. That's fucked. Yeah. In many educational institutions, for instance, if after a classroom observation a teacher is graded as satisfactory, they'll be required to undertake training prior to a reassessment. Initially, it might appear to be a mystery that bureaucratic measures should have intensified under neoliberal governments that have presented themselves as anti-bureaucratic and anti-Stalinist. Yet new types of bureaucracy, aims and objectives, outcomes, mission statements have proliferated, even as neoliberal rhetoric about the end of top-down centralized control has gained preeminence. It might seem that bureaucracy is a kind of return of the repressed, ironically re-emerging at the heart of a system which has professed to destroy it. But the resurgence of bureaucracy in neoliberalism is more than an atavism or an anomaly. Atavism? The tendency to revert to something more ancient or ancestral. Okay. Yeah, no, it seems kind of relevant and accurate, but you're right, it is funny. But that's it. I mean, he's being provocative, but he's also being provocative specifically for nerds like you and me. Anyone else reading this would be like, okay, literally, what are you talking about? As I've already indicated, there's no contradiction between being smart and the increase of administration and regulation. These are two sides of labor and control societies. Richard Sennett has argued that the flattening of pyramidal hierarchies has actually led to more surveillance of workers. One of the claims made for the new organization of work is that it decentralizes power, That is, gives people in the lower ranks of organization more control over their own activities, Senate writes. Certainly this claim is false in terms of the techniques employed for taking apart the old bureaucratic behemoths. The new information systems provide a comprehensive picture of the organization to top managers in ways which give individuals anywhere in the network little room to hide. But it isn't only that information technology has granted managers more access to data, it's that the data itself has proliferated. Much of this information is provided by workers themselves. Massimo De Angelis and David Harvey, I wonder if that's David Harvey, it's spelt differently. If it's a typo, no, it must not be. Describe some of the bureaucratic measures with which a lecturer must comply when putting together a module for an undergraduate degree in British universities. For each module, De Angelis and Harvey write, the module leader, ML, i.e. lecturer, must complete various paperwork, in particular a module specification at the module start, which lists the module's aims and objectives, ILOs, modes and methods of assessment, amongst other information, and a module review document at the other end of the module in which the ML reports their own assessment of the module's strengths and weaknesses, and the suggested changes for the following year, a summary of the student feedback, and average marks, and the dispersion. This is only the beginning, however. For the degree program as a whole, academics must prepare a program specification as well as producing annual program reports, which record student performance according to progression rates, withdrawal rates, location, and spread of marks. I've just realized I've started slipping into the, what's it called? Power thirst? Do you want to feel so efficient? You're going to need program specifications, annual program reports, progression rates, withdrawal rates, location, and spread of marks. And all students' marks have to be graded against a matrix. That's right, I'll stop doing that immediately, don't worry. This auto-surveillance is complemented by assessments carried out by external authorities. The marking of student assessments is monitored by external examiners, who are supposed to maintain consistency of standards across the university sector. Lecturers have to be observed by their peers, while departments are subject to periodic 3 or 4 day inspections by the Quality Assurance Agency for Higher Education. If they are research active, lecturers must submit their best 4 publications every 4 or 5 years to be graded by a panel as part of the research assessment exercise. De Angelis and Harvey are clear that these are only very sketchy accounts of only some of the bureaucratic tasks that academics have to perform, all of which have funding implications for institutions. This battery of bureaucratic procedures is by no means confined to universities nor to education. Other public services, such as the NHS and the police force, find themselves enmeshed in similar bureaucratic metastases. This is in part a consequence of the inherent resistance to certain processes and services to marketization. The supposed marketization of education, for instance, rests on a confused and undeveloped analogy. Are students the consumers or the service, or its product? The idealized market was supposed to deliver friction-free exchanges in which the desires of consumers would be met directly without the need for intervention or mediation by regulatory agencies. Which is ridiculous. This reminds me of the, donuts and lines thing, or whatever it's called. I can't remember what it's from. There's some, famous, business analysis from the 80s, I want to say, where someone puts down all of the, links between organizations in an economy, and they're like, look, we think that we're organized around businesses or firms or whatever, but actually there's way more happening in the interaction between businesses and firms than within the firms themselves, or something. I can't remember the point. Anyway, whatever. Just forget whatever I just said. Yet the drive to assess the performance of workers and to measure forms of labor which, by their nature, are resistant to quantification, has inevitably required additional layers of management and bureaucracy. What we have is not a direct comparison of workers' performance or output, but a comparison between the audited representation of that performance and output. Pardon me. Inevitably, a short-circuiting occurs, and work becomes geared towards the generation and massaging of representations, rather than to the official goals of the work itself. Indeed, an anthropological study of local government in Britain argues that more effort goes into ensuring that a local authority's services are represented correctly than goes into actually improving the services. This reversal of priorities is one of the hallmarks of a system which can be characterized without hyperbole, as market Stalinism. What late capitalism repeats from Stalinism is just this valuing of symbols of achievement over actual achievement. As Marshall Berman explained during describing Stalin's White Sea Canal project of 31 to 33, Stalin seems to have been so intent on creating a highly visible symbol of development that he pushed and squeezed the project in ways that only retarded the development of the project. Thus, the workers and the engineers were never allowed the time, money, or equipment necessary to build a canal that would be deep enough and safe enough to carry 20th century cargoes. Consequently, the canal has never played any significant role in Soviet commerce or industry. All the canal could support, apparently, oh gosh, why am I yelling so much? Were tourist steamers, which in the 1930s were abundantly stocked with Soviet and foreign writers who obligingly proclaimed the glories of the work. The canal was a triumph of publicity, but if half the care that went into the public relations campaign had been devoted to the work itself, there would have been far fewer victims and far more real developments, and the project would have been a genuine tragedy rather than a brutal farce in which real people were killed by pseudo-events. That's funny, I like the idea of a pseudo-event. In a strange compulsion to repeat, the ostensibly anti-Stalinist neoliberal New Labour government has shown the same tendency to implement initiatives in which real-world effects matter only insofar as they register at the level of PR appearance. This reminds me a lot of, like, Scott Morrison, especially, being, like, Scotty from marketing, but just thinking about, like, I don't know, just everything he did during the pandemic, the, like, I don't hold a hose mate thing. Well, it's not exactly that. That's kind of the opposite, right? Where he's, like, negatively registered at the level of PR appearance, or, like, whatever he may or may not have done to deal with the bushfires just obliterated by him hanging around in Hawaii. Anyway. Or like Trump, you know, they didn't build a wall. That didn't matter. At any stage, it didn't matter that he was that he didn't build the wall. Anyway, it was just registered at the level of appearance. The notorious targets which the New Labour government was so enthusiastic in imposing are a case in point. In a process that repeats itself with iron predictability everywhere that they're installed, targets quickly cease to be a way of measuring performance and become ends in themselves. It's like Tony Abbott changing the closing the gap targets. Or maybe that was Morrison as well. Anxiety about falling standards in school examinations, now a regular feature of the summertime in Britain. Yet if students are less skilled and knowledgeable than their predecessors, this is due not to a decline in the quality of examinations per se, but to the fact that all of the teaching is geared towards passing the exams. Narrowly focused exam drill replaces a wider engagement with the subjects. Similarly, hospitals perform many routine procedures instead of a few serious urgent operations, because this allows them to hit the targets they're assessed on, operating rates, success rates, and reduction in waiting time more effectively. Amen. It would be a mistake to regard this market Stalinism as some deviation from the true spirit of capitalism. On the contrary, it would be better to say that an essential dimension of Stalinism was inhibited only by its association with a social project like socialism, and can only emerge in late capitalist culture in which images acquire an autonomous force. Very interesting. I'm not sure it's only in late capitalist culture in which images acquire an autonomous force, but anyway, that's fine. The way value is generated on the stock exchange depends, of course, less on what a company really does, and more on perceptions of and beliefs about its future performance. In capitalism, that is to say, all that is solid melts into PR. That's a Marx reference? All that is solid melts into thin air? Is that what he says? Just disconnect it. Yeah. Melts into air? Is that Marx? No. It's the name of a book by Marshall Berman. Marx? Surely it's a Marx quote. Ah, yeah, it's from the Communist Manifesto. All that is solid melts into air, all that is holy is profaned, and man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real condition of life and his relations with his kind. There you go. And late capitalism is defined as much by this ubiquitous tendency towards PR production as it is by the imposition of market mechanisms. Here, Zizek's, and he spells Zizek with the Chupchiks here. Maybe it was Zupancic who he didn't put the Chupchiks on. Anyway. Here, Zizek's elaboration of Lacan's concept of the big other is crucial. The big other is the collective fiction, the symbolic structure presupposed by any social field. The big other can never be encountered in itself. Instead, we only ever confront its stand-ins. These representatives are by no means always leaders. In the example of the White Sea Canal above, for instance, it wasn't Stalin himself who was the representative of the big other, so much as the Soviet and foreign writers who had to be persuaded of the glories of the project. One important dimension of the big other is that it does not know everything. It is this constitutive ignorance of the big other that allows public relations to function. This is a really good thing. I think he talks about this earlier on, and I probably rambled about this at the time. But one of the famous parts of the big other, one of its aspects, is the subject supposed to know, which is often written SSS, because in French it's subject supposé savoir, I think. Subject supposed to know. And so that's the person who, when you say, like, well, someone knows what's happening, that's who the someone is. Or like, you know what they say, that's the they who says it, is the big other. And there's another version of it, which is the subject supposed not to know, which is like when you're at dinner and you fart really loudly and everyone kind of pretends not to notice and you just get on with the meal. That's because the big other is not aware of you farting. Even though everyone there knows about it, if someone was going to be like, wow, that smells, suddenly like the big other would have become aware of it or something. Or it reminds me of one time I went to like a family Shabbat or Passover or something when I was 16, and I had a bunch of hickeys on my neck, and I was just talking to my cousins, and I was like, okay, cool, no one said anything, I think I'm in the clear. And then my cousin Tom was like, wow, there's a lot of hickeys there, and my other cousin like hit him on the arm and was like, we were all not saying anything, dude. And at that moment the big other became aware of my hickeys and I became embarrassed. Anyway, one important dimension of the big other is that it does not know everything. It's this constitutive ignorance of the big other that allows public relations to function. Indeed, the big other could be defined as the consumer of PR and propaganda, the virtual figure which is required to believe, even when no individual can. To use one of Zizek's examples, who was it, for instance, who didn't know that really existing socialism was shabby and corrupt? Not any of the people who were all too aware of its shortcomings, nor any of the government administrators who couldn't but know. No, it was the big other who was the one deemed not to know, who wasn't allowed to know the quotidian reality of really existing socialism. Yet the distinction between what the big other knows, i.e. what is officially accepted, and what is widely known and experienced by actual individuals, is very far from being merely emptily formal. It's the discrepancy between the two that allows ordinary social reality to function. Which is why Lacanian psychotics are so disconnected from, like, the social world, right? So the psychotic is defined in Lacan as someone who forecloses the possibility of the big other. And so that's the way I like to think about this is my shorthand. There's other ways in which this is the case. But for Lacan, a schizophrenic is a subset of psychosis, or of a psychotic. Remember, these are diagnostic categories that aren't necessarily related to the ones in the DSM. It's Lacanian horoscopes, basically. They just happen to have the same names as some modern diseases. So, for Lacan, a schizophrenic is a type of psychotic. And if you imagine, like, an actual, well, like a stereotype, at least, of a schizophrenic person who hears voices. And I don't want to get into whether or not that's like a very accurate reading of schizophrenic, but for the point of this example, we'll assume that it is okay. So the schizophrenic hears voices and they appear real to them because they can't appreciate the way in which language doesn't really connect closely to the world. And so when you hear language, it must become, like, real in some way. And so the voices become, like, attached to an actual being that they assume must be there or something like that. Or, yeah, anyway, don't want to go too deep into that, but I like this idea of the big other has to be maintained, and the difference between what the big other knows and the individual knows has to be maintained in order for society to continue running. And the disconnect of psychotics from the big other is why the rest of society finds them so hard to manage, basically. Because they don't hide things from the big other. When the illusion that the big other did not know can no longer be maintained, the incorporeal fabric holding the social system together disintegrates. This is why in Khrushchev's speech in 1965, in which he admitted the failings of the Soviet state, was so momentous. It's not as if anyone in the party was unaware of the atrocities and corruption carried out in its name, but Khrushchev's announcement made it impossible to believe anymore that the big other was ignorant of them. So much for really existing socialism, but what of really existing capitalism? One way to understand the realism of capitalist realism is in terms of the claim to have given up belief in the big other. Right, it's become schizophrenic. Psychotic. Postmodernism can be construed as the name for the complex of crises that the decline in the belief of the big other has triggered, as in Lyotard's famous formulation of the postmodern condition, incredulity towards meta-narratives, suggests. Right, so like, the big other is the one for whom the meta-narratives occur, and the one that notices them, something like that. And so the postmodern move is to reject that entirely. There's no possibility of a big other. But the big other also, like, justifies a bunch of injustice and violence, as in, like, comrades, in 100 years, the workers will be in power, and they'll look back on us, and they'll know that we were fighting for them. And so there's this kind of, like, retroactive being seen by this, like, communist big other of the future, who might be, you know, imagined as a single actual person, but it is psychically is a big other. Jameson, of course, would argue that the incredulity towards meta-narratives is one expression of the cultural logic of late capitalism, a consequence of the switch into the post-Fordist mode of capital accumulation. Another example of this is the Che Guevara t-shirt, right? That, like, capital has no shame in terms of incorporating those opposed to it. The big other doesn't know that Che was an anti-capitalist. The big other just knows that the shirts sell. And that you're alternative if you wear one. But there's also a really good video by Plastic Pills. I'll get a link for it here. Here we go. Anti-Oedipus on schizoanalysis and capitalism. I'll pop the link in there. You should watch that. It does a lot about talking about schizophrenia and capital, which obviously that was the name of Deleuze and Guattari's books, Capitalism and Schizophrenia. But I think this video does a really good, fairly straightforward job of explaining the relationship between those two on a structural level. And I think it informs this chapter quite nicely. Nick Land, crowd booing, gives one of the most euphoric accounts of the postmodern meltdown of culture into the economy. In Land's work, a cybernetically upgraded invisible hand is progressively eliminating centralized state power. In Land's 90s text, Synthesized Cybernetics, Complexity Theory, Nick Land is a douchebag. He was a colleague/student of Mark Fisher's. You might have heard the story about one time he went to give a lecture at uni or something, and he just blasted some jungle music and lay on the ground, like, moaning into the mic and kind of, like, thrashing on the floor. And one of his students got up and said, "Some of us are still Marxists, you know," and walked out, which is a great story. But he writes a bunch of, like, explicitly racist, fascist, pro-capital stuff. Fenged Noumena is his famous work, I think. And he's a right accelerationist / fascist accelerationist. Basically, he thinks that humans are kind of like meat puppets for capital. Yeah. And he and Nick worked together at the CCRU. He and Mark Fisher worked together for a long time. Yeah, he's a piece of shit, basically. It doesn't mean he's not a good philosopher, but he's responsible for everyone who has bad politics now. No, that's a joke, but Land's 90s text Synthesized Cybernetics, Complexity Theory, Cyberpunk Fiction, and Neoliberalism, and a lot of speed to construct a vision of capital planetary artificial intelligence. A vast, supple, endlessly fissile system which renders human will obsolete. In his manifesto for nonlinear decentered capital, Meltdown, Land invokes a massively distributed, matrix networked tendency oriented to disabling RUM command control programs sustaining all macro and micro governmental systems, globally concentrating themselves as the human security system. That's the other thing, is he's fucking insane and impossible to read. Yikes. Oh yeah, we gotta be disabling RUM command control programs. Statement dreamed up by the utterly deranged. This is capitalism as a shattering real. He's gonna say it here soon, Deleuze and Guattari. But yeah, this is capital as a deterritorializing process. A shattering real, in which viral digital signals circulate on self-sustaining networks which bypass the symbolic, and therefore do not require the big other as guarantor. I'm building an AI language model that I think will be better than OpenAI's GPT, but I don't know how to share it with the world without making the world worse due to capitalism. Ooh, that's an interesting thing that I don't really feel qualified to comment on in great detail. I guess I would say, first up, lo alecha hamlecha, like more like you don't have to end capitalism or even not participate in it. You're allowed to make money from your work, even if that might be like less than optimally ethical. But also you could like open source it. That way, good guys can steal it as well as bad guys. I don't know. Yeah, I would just try not to let that worry you too much. Just fucking sell it, make millions of dollars, and, you know, buy me a nice house or something. You know, make the world better. Yeah, fucking sell that shit, my friend. Obtain the bag. Is Deleuze and Guattari's capital as unnameable thing? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But without the forces of reterritorialization and anti-production, which they argued were constitutive of capitalism. Interesting, interesting. One of the problems of Land's position is also what is most interesting about it. Precisely that it posits a pure capitalism, a capitalism which is only inhibited and blocked by extrinsic rather than internal elements. According to Land's logic, these elements are atavisms that will eventually be consumed and metabolized by capital. I could believe it. Yet capitalism cannot be purified in this way. Strip away the forces of anti-production and capitalism disappears with them. This reminds me of the program set forth in Inventing the Future by Sinacek and Williams. Dropping that in the chat. Strongly recommend reading it. Really good. Much easier to read than this, I would say. One of my favorite pieces of political philosophy. I think a couple of chapters at the start, which are about the neoliberal thought collective and think tanks and folk politics, I think are maybe two of the best essays on political philosophy I've ever read. So maybe we'll do that after we finish Capital Realism, actually, because it's been a really long time. But they have this whole concept of non-reformist reforms. And it sounds like it's basically this idea. Strip away the forces of anti-production and capitalism disappears with them. And so they propose all of these policy mechanisms that form a ratchet, as they call it, that would, yeah, no worries. I really enjoy having your company, by the way. It really makes a big difference. Like, I would not be reading this if there weren't a couple of people hanging out with me. So, yeah, it really makes a big difference for me as well. Anyway, they think that it will push things that would be acceptable to, like, parliamentary democracies, but that would then push the economy outside of a stable capitalism. Anyway. Similarly, there's no progressive tendency towards an unsheathing of capitalism, no gradual unmasking of capital as it really is, rapacious, indifferent, inhuman. On the contrary, the essential role of the incorporeal transformations, effectuated by PR, branding, and advertising in capitalism, suggests that in order to operate effectively, capitalism's rapacity depends on various forms of sheathing. I mean, that makes sense to me, right? Like, he's basically saying, like, if we all thought about how bad it was all the time, we wouldn't be participating, and then the system wouldn't function. Really existing capitalism is marked by the same division which characterized really existing socialism. Between, on the one hand, an official culture in which capitalist enterprises are presented as socially responsible and caring, and on the other, a widespread awareness that companies are actually corrupt, ruthless, and so on. In other words, capitalist postmodernity is not quite as incredulous as it would appear to be, as the jeweler Gerald Ratner famously found to his cost. Yeah, maybe. It's like that scene from The Wire where the bunk talks to McNulty about, it was your first time, I wanted to make it special. Ratner precisely tried to circumvent the symbolic and tell it how it is, describing the inexpensive jewelry his shop sold as crap in an after-dinner speech. But the consequences of Ratner making this judgment official were immediate and serious. $500 million pounds was wiped off the value of the company, and he lost his job. Customers might previously have known that the jewelry Ratner sold was poor quality, but the big other didn't know. As soon as it did, Ratner's collapsed. This reminds me as well of short sellers. I don't know if you know much about short selling. There's a great podcast called Risk of Ruin. Maybe if anyone's interested, I'll find Risk of Ruin, short selling. And of course, that's not showed me any podcasts. That's just showed me a bunch of investment pages that talk about Risk of Ruin. It's a really good podcast about gambling. 0 by way of 100? I'm not sure. I'll send it to you later, 30 wax or whatever. But short selling is basically when you agree to sell shares of a company in the future at a certain price. Risk of Ruin? Not rain. Ruin. It's a podcast about gambling. And so then if the stock price drops between when you make the deal and when you actually sell it, I know you did. I don't think you'll enjoy the rest of the show that much, but there's a couple of really good investment episodes. Anyway. So there are these people who specifically... Yeah, exactly. And then buy them and give them back. It's a bit weird. I don't understand the specific mechanics. But basically, if the stock loses value... You're betting against the stock. So if the stock loses value, you make money. And so there are these companies who specialize in researching companies, discovering that they're fraudulent, short selling a bunch, and then publishing the information. And so they'll do all of this really good research and discover that the office building is just a shack on a beach. That happened in Australia a little while ago. And there's not even a post box there. Literally no mail goes there, whatever. And then you just short sell millions of dollars and then send a report to every trading house on Wall Street and every journalist in the country, and hopefully people take notice of it. But apparently they get a lot of death threats. But anyway, that's doing this on purpose, alerting the big other to the fact that there's something going on. Vernacular postmodernism has dealt with the crisis. I wonder actually if that's really the reason that short selling is so frowned upon, is because it's basically narking to the big other. Not because it loses people money, but because it's narking. Vernacular postmodernism has dealt with the crisis of symbolic efficiency in a far less intense way than Nick Land, through metafictional anxieties about the function of the author, and in television programs or films which expose the mechanisms of their own productions, and reflexively incorporate discussions of their own status as commodities. #The Matrix. But postmodernism's supposed gestures of demystification do not evince sophistication so much as a certain naivete, a conviction that there were others in the past who really believed in the symbolic. In fact, of course, symbolic efficiency was achieved precisely by maintaining a clear distinction between a material empirical causality... Sorry, all of these words have just immediately stopped having meaning. Do not evince sophistication. Okay, so the way that postmodernism does it is we've discovered recently there's no meta-narratives. But those Romans thought there were. Those Marxists thought there were. In fact, of course, symbolic efficiency, meaning the way in which words actually have an effect, I'm not really sure what he means in this particular case, was achieved precisely by maintaining a clear distinction between a material empirical causality and another incorporeal causality proper to the symbolic. You're so right, Two Curbs. I mean, I honestly think Mark Fisher is not as bad as many others. This chapter's been a bit worse than the rest of the book. The first few chapters were beautiful, straight, clear, really poetically written, but in a way that grabbed you and showed you what you meant. Right, exactly, Two Curbs. And honestly, I really hope that me doing this is helpful for people who wouldn't be reading this shit otherwise. And as I said, I wouldn't be reading this shit otherwise. And I find this kind of sentence hard to understand. So like, and I literally have a degree in reading this book. So like, it's all good. Gives you, yeah, well, he gives you movies to watch. Yeah. Oh, maybe I should do a stream where we watch Pervert's Guide to Cinema and Ideology. That would be fun. But basically, this is actually a really straightforward remark, I think. So there's like material causality and there's symbolic linguistic causality. So what's an example of that? Like, say someone gets injured at work. There's the material cause of like, they put their finger in the slicing machine or whatever, but there's an incorporeal causality proper to the symbolic where like they had to pay rent, which meant that they had to take this job that didn't have good safety conditions, or like the training wasn't done properly, which is again like an issue about language of like someone hasn't said the right words to this employee, or like something like that, I think, right? So that we kind of, especially us Marxists, tend to try to downplay the causality proper to the symbolic. Like we like to be hard-nosed materialists, and anything involving language is too soft. Yes, I'm with you too, Curbs. And again, I actually think this book is better than a lot of others in that regard, because he does actually make really concrete proposals. He's just doing all of the wank on the way there. So the first two chapters were like, problem with capitalism is mental illness and bureaucracy. We can deal with that if we do something about it. And then these next couple of chapters seem to be him going into like quite a lot of detail justifying all of those claims. And then I think at the last few chapters, he's like, right, this is what I want you to do. So hopefully we'll get there. But yes, I agree. I think it's very easy for smart people to think that writing like this is valuable. That's true, 30 Wax. Or you read something and you don't understand one word and you're like, it's probably not important, I'll just move on. Like here, I just kind of kept reading after I faded out. And then I was like, wait a minute, I didn't understand anything I just said. Let's do that again slowly. So, who knows? Zizek gives the example of a judge. I know very well that things are the way I see them, that this person is a corrupted weakling, but I nonetheless treat him respectfully, since he wears the insignia of a judge, so that when he speaks, it's the law itself which speaks through him. However, postmodernism's cynical reduction to reality falls short. When a judge speaks, there is in a way more truth in his words, the words of the institution of law, than in the direct reality of the person of judge. If one limits oneself to what one sees, one simply misses the point. Sorry, I misread that. There's more truth in his words than the direct reality of the person of the judge. If one limits oneself to what one sees, one simply misses the point. Lacan aims at this paradox with his Le Non du Pain. The person who doesn't get duped, or who goes astray by not being duped, which is a word for psychotics, basically. Those who do not allow themselves to be caught in the symbolic deception/fiction, who continue to believe their eyes, are the ones who err most. A cynic who believes only in his eyes misses the efficiency of the symbolic fiction and how it structures our experience of reality. Yeah, so this is exactly what I was talking about psychotics, right? Who do not allow themselves to be caught in the symbolic deception/fiction, which makes me wonder if I'm psychotically structured, but I doubt it. And so this reminds, like, for Lacan, the treatment of a neurotic is to discover that there is no big other, that the big other is a fiction. But for a psychotic, they first have to realize that the big other does exist before, to basically move into neurosis, before they can then be cured by understanding the big other doesn't exist. So there's this, like, kind of return to where they were, but on a different level. And there's a nice example of that, which is like, if you went to a high school and you were like, so who are the popular kids? Who are the nerds? Or, and someone was like, oh, the big other doesn't exist. There's no such thing as popularity. You'd be like, okay, but there are cool kids. There's uncool kids. So, like, you're clearly wrong. But at another level, like, there isn't actually an external guarantor of those people being popular. Like, the social fabric could change at some point. Anyway, whatever. I think you get the general issue. Much of Baudrillard's work was a commentary on this same effect, the way in which the abolition of the symbolic led not to a direct encounter with the real, but to a kind of hemorrhaging of the real. This reminds me, Baudrillard is the one who does Zach's favorite meme, which is the like, and yet there is a piece of dinosaur left in these chicken nuggets meme, or, you know that one? Anyway, I think that kind of, and yet an echo of the original self is found in the symbolic, or whatever, you know, yeah. For Baudrillard, phenomena such as fly-on-the-wall documentaries and political opinion polls, both of which claim to present reality in an unmediated way, would always pose an insoluble dilemma. Did the presence of the cameras affect the behavior of those being filmed? Would the publication of poll results affect the future behavior of voters? Such questions were undecidable, and therefore reality would always be elusive. At the very moment when it seemed that it was being grasped in the raw, reality transformed into what Baudrillard, in a much misunderstood neologism, called hyperreality. Uncannily echoing Baudrillard's fixations, the most successful reality TV programs end up fusing fly-on-the-wall documentary elements with interactive polling. Do they? Or was Big Brother just the only reality TV show in 2009? In effect, there are two levels of reality in these shows, the unscripted behavior of the real-life participants on screen, and the unpredictable responses of the audience at home, which in turn affect the behavior of the on-screen participants. Yet reality TV is continually haunted by questions about fiction and illusion. Are the participants acting, suppressing certain aspects of their personality in order to appear more appealing to us, the audience? And have the audience's votes been accurately registered, or is there some kind of a fix? And here we go, an admission. The slogan that the Big Brother TV show uses, "You decide," captures perfectly the mode of control by feedback that, according to Baudrillard, has replaced old centralized forms of power. We ourselves occupy the empty seat of power, phoning and clicking in our responses. TV's Big Brother has superseded Orwell's Big Brother. Wow, that's the lamest sentence I've ever read in a book of philosophy. Get your shit together, Mark. We, the audience, are not subjected to a power that comes from outside. Rather, we are integrated into a control circuit that has our desires and preferences as its only mandate. But those desires and preferences are returned to us, no longer as ours, but as the desires of the big other. Clearly, these circuits are not confined to television. Cybernetic feedback systems, focus groups, demographic surveys, are now integral to the delivery of all services, including education and government. This returns us to the issue of post-Fordist bureaucracy. There is, of course, a close relationship between bureaucracy, the discourse of officialdom, I like that as a definition for bureaucracy, it's not very helpful, but I like it, and the big other. Witness two of Zizek's own examples of the big other at work. A low-level official who, having not been informed of a promotion, says, "Sorry, I have not yet been properly informed about this new measure, so I can't help you." Okay. A woman who believed that she was suffering bad luck because of the number of her house, who could not be satisfied by simply repainting a different number herself because it has to be done properly by the responsible state institution. It's very funny. As if it's the state that decides that it's really like 46 whatever street. I mean, I guess in a sense it is. But like, even if they made it like 47A or something, like... What? Yeah, I'm not sure, given to rant. I'm lost here. I'm lost. Does anyone have any ideas about this bit? We're all familiar with... Well, I mean, okay, the second one makes sense on an abstract level in terms of, like, she wants her symbolic belief to be fixed in the big other, for the big other to register the fact that it's fixed, because otherwise it doesn't matter. It reminds me... there's a bunch of stuff, whatever. Reminds me of a bunch of stuff. Alright, oh yeah, okay, so this one. The Stoics, I think it's Marcus Aurelius, has a bunch of, like, plans for people to improve their willpower. And one of them is, on a hot day, take a big mouthful of cold water and then spit it out without drinking any. And then don't tell anyone about it. And his point is specifically, don't register it in the big other. Because at that point, you're not merely improving your willpower, you're actually doing some kind of social performance where you're asking for other people to acknowledge that you have willpower or something like that. And he's trying to keep it out of the realm of the symbolic and in the realm of the real, which I think is interesting. But she's like, no, I have to tell someone I spat out the water or it won't count. People are weird superstitial idiots. I mean superstitious. Superstitial means something else that it would be exactly the kind of pretentious thing that Mark would say, but I don't know what that means. We're all familiar with bureaucratic libido, with the enjoyment that certain officials derive from this position of disavowed responsibility. It's not me, I'm afraid. It's the regulations. I don't make Brannigan's law, I just enforce it. The frustration of dealing with bureaucrats often arises because they're of the cold presser text? I don't know what you mean, sorry. Could you say a little more about that? The frustration of dealing with bureaucrats often arises because they themselves can make no decisions. Rather, they're permitted only to refer to decisions that have already been made by the big other. Kafka was the greatest writer on bureaucracy because he saw that this structure of disavowal was inherent to bureaucracy. The quest to reach the ultimate authority who will finally resolve K's official status can never end, because the big other cannot be encountered in itself. There are only officials, more or less hostile, engaged in acts of interpretation about what the big other's intentions are. There's a word missing there, I think. And these acts of interpretation, these deferrals of responsibility, are all that the big other is. So this is something I really like, and this is more of a Lacanian point than a Mark Fishy point. But, for Lacan, the big other is like a psychic organ in the same way that the liver is like a physical organ. It's like a part of our mental world. But it's one that we all collectively create together. Hold a bar in icy water for 3 minutes. To induce low-level stress, but the problem is the test itself. Huh, okay. I'll look that up later. But interesting. Alright. What was it saying? Because it's a psychic organ, right? So, like, although it represents this external social force, it's actually what Lacan calls extimate, which is, like, intimate but on the outside. I really like that word, even though it's confusing as heck, and he could do with less jargon. I think it's his most reasonable jargon. But you can never encounter the big other as such, right? Because it's like saying you can't meet someone else's imaginary friend, or, like, maybe kind of you can. You could have a conversation where both of you are agreeing, but yeah. Right. Totally. That's such a good point. And I think that's exactly what Mark is saying, right? Is that he's saying the big other does have some symbolic efficiency. Like, it does have power, but the power is sort of instantiated collectively through the actual human beings who participate in it. I could be wrong about that, but that's my point. The big other is not substantial, right? It only exists through these acts of interpretation and deferrals of responsibility. Like, the cops really could just not shoot those people, but they choose to, and then they justify it through this, like, symbolic force. If Kafka is valuable as a commentator on totalitarianism, it's by revealing that there was a dimension of totalitarianism which cannot be understood on the model of despotic command. Kafka's purgatorial vision of a bureaucratic labyrinth without end chimes with Zizek's claim that the Soviet system was an empire of signs, in which even the nomenclatura themselves, that is the like upper echelons of Soviet society, including Stalin and Molotov, were engaged in interpreting a complex series of social semiotic signs. No one knew what was required. Instead, individuals could only guess what particular gestures or directives meant. Exactly. That's such a good way of putting it, Curbs. I think that's, like, exactly the point, and it's a really good way of remembering it. I'm going to try and keep that. They justify those who die by wearing the badge, and they're clothed in white. Yeah, but, like, the badge is this, like, symbolic presence that, as you say, justifies these, like, real impacts. No, I know it's not. Yeah. But I think, like, something that I try actively to do while reading this kind of, like, pretentious philosophy is to find the, like, crunchiest, most real and boring examples of it, or, like, even just, like, stereotypes of it. Like, I think I've said before, my way of remembering what neurotic, psychotic, and perverse are, the three main Lacanian psychic structures, is the hosts from the last podcast on the left. Ben's neurotic, Marcus is psychotic, and Henry is perverse. And, like, that's not necessarily true, but yeah, mnemonics are super useful for this kind of stuff because a lot of it's super obscure. And so, like, literally, like, a song lyric that you can attach to a concept is, like, unbelievably valuable. So thank you. That's really useful for me, and I hope you hang on to it too. What happens in late capitalism when there's no possibility of appealing, even in principle, to a final authority which can offer the definitive official version is a massive intensification of that ambiguity. Hashtag the NDIS. I knew someone who used to work sort of around the NDIS, and there was a practice that was not known to the big other. I'll put it like that. So, like, everyone did it, but it was not an official thing that they were told to do. Call up the NDIA, you get an answer, and if it's not a good one, you wait 5 minutes and call back and try and get put onto a different person and get an answer from that different person. And then whichever one is better, you take that answer and you're like, well, I spoke to Paul at 3:16. Yeah. So there's no final authority which can offer the definitive official version. There's a massive intensification of that ambiguity. Yeah, that's right, given to Rand. I think that's a good way of doing it, yeah. As an example of this syndrome, let us turn once more to further education. At a meeting between trade union officials, college principals, and members of parliament, the Learning and Skills Council, the Quango, at the heart of the FE funding labyrinth? Quango? It's the greatest word I've ever heard, but I've never... A semi-public administrative body outside the civil service but receiving financial support from the government which makes senior appointments to it. It's so short for quasi-autonomous NGO. That's amazing. That's so funny. Okay. The Learning and Skills Council, the Quango at the heart of the FE funding lab. So like the Cancer Council or whatever, right? Like that kind of thing. I've never heard that term. Well, I mean, I've read this book before, so I guess I must have, but... came in for particular attack. Great word going right in my vocab, hell yeah. Neither the teachers nor the principals nor the MPs could determine how particular directives had generated themselves, since they are not there in government policy itself. The answer was that the LSC interpreted these instructions issued by the Department for Education and Skills. These interpretations then achieved the strange autonomy peculiar to bureaucracy. On the one hand, bureaucratic procedures float freely, independent of any external authority. Yeah, right, okay. But that very autonomy means that they assume a heavy implacability, a resistance to any amendment or questioning. Reminds me of sometimes when I, do mental health quizzes at the GP or whatever. They'll be like, sorry, I'm sure you've done a million of these, but we just have to do it. It's like, who said we have to do it? And like, maybe someone did at some point, but yeah. The proliferation of auditing culture in post-Fordism indicates that the demise of the big other has been exaggerated. That's a funny, like, yeah, okay, that makes sense, yeah. A couple of literary references. Rumors of my death have been greatly exaggerated, but then also, like, God is dead, but, like, the big other is dead, but, like, the rumors of the death of God have been greatly exaggerated. Anyway, I don't know. Maybe that's intentional or maybe it's not. Auditing can perhaps best be conceived as a fusion of PR and bureaucracy, because the bureaucratic data is usually intended to fulfill a promotional role. Makes sense? In the case of education, for example, exam results or research ratings augment or diminish the prestige of particular institutions. The frustration for the teacher is that it seems as if their work is increasingly aimed at impressing the big other, which is collating and consuming this data. Data has been put in inverted commas here because of the so-called information. Much of the so-called information has little meaning or application outside the parameters of the audit. As Eva Berglund puts it, the information that audit creates does have consequences, even though it is so shorn of local detail, so abstract as to be misleading or meaningless, except, that is, by the aesthetic criteria of audit itself. That's a fun and fluffy paragraph. I'm not sure it's that valuable, but anyway. New bureaucracy takes the form not of a specific delimited function, performed by particular workers, but invades all areas of work, with the result that, as Kafka prophesied, workers become their own auditors, forced to assess their own performance. I'm sure there's a bunch of kindergarten audits. The new system that Ofsted, the Office for Standards in Education, uses to inspect further education colleges, which, if I recall correctly, basically like TAFEs, that Mark Fisher is really keen on because they're like working class alternatives to university. Royal Commissions. Yeah, that is a good example. Except I think they're also talking about... I think he's talking more about the on-the-ground bureaucracy where, like... I don't know about education, but in hospitality, someone has to measure the temperature, the internal temperature of every fridge on the premises every day and make a record of it, just in case they get audited. But then if it is low on one day, like, nothing happens about it, right? Like, it's only kept as a record in case someone gets horribly sick and you have to prove that you didn't do it. Which doesn't happen very often, but you still have to... The workers become their own auditors, right? I mean, maybe that's not an example of self-performance evaluation. Anyway, whatever. Under the old system, a college would have a heavy inspection once every 4 years or so, i.e. one involving many lesson observations and a large number of inspectors present at the college. Under the new improved system, if a college can demonstrate that its internal assessment systems are effective, it would only have to undergo a light inspection. But the downside of this light inspection is obvious. Surveillance and monitoring are outsourced from Ofsted to the college and ultimately to lecturers themselves, and become a permanent feature of the college structure and of the psychology of individual lecturers. The difference between the old heavy and new light inspection system corresponds precisely to Kafka's distinction between ostensible acquittal and indefinite postponement, outlined above, I think in chapter 2 or whatever. With ostensible acquittal, you petition the lower court judges until they grant you a non-binding reprieve. Do you think bureaucracy would be more or less frustrating if most human acts are replaced by AI language models? I think it would functionally not make a difference. I think that the amount of bureaucracy would increase to the amount of technology available to fix it. It's like how dishwashers didn't end up saving any time for then housewives as they were, like, it gave them more time to do the laundry kind of thing. Like, I think basically Mark's point is not that we need new technology to make bureaucracy more efficient, is that we need a new relationship to powers of authority and power, and labor and capital. You petition the lower court judges until they grant you a non-binding reprieve. You're then free from court until the time when your case is reopened. Indefinite postponement, meanwhile, keeps your case at the lowest level of court, but at the cost of an anxiety that never ends. Again, that's a little typo there. The changes in Ofsted inspections are mirrored by in the change. Well, there's been a lot of typos here. It's really weird. The changes in Ofsted inspections are mirrored in the change from the research assessment exercise to the research excellence framework in higher education. Periodic assessment will be superseded by a permanent and ubiquitous measurement, which cannot help but generate the same perpetual anxiety. In any case, it's not as if the light inspection is in any sense preferable for staff than the heavy one. The inspectors are in college for the same amount of time as they were under the old system. The fact that there are fewer of them does nothing to alleviate the stress of the inspection, which has far more to do with the extra bureaucratic window dressing one has to do in anticipation of a possible observation than it does with any actual observation itself. The inspection, that is to say, corresponds precisely to Foucault's account of the virtual nature of surveillance and discipline and punish. Foucault famously observes that there is no need for the place of surveillance to actually be occupied. This is the famous panopticon. The effect of not knowing whether you'll be observed or not produces an introjection of the surveillance apparatus. You constantly act as if you are always about to be observed. Yet in the case of school and university inspections, what you'll be graded on is not primarily your abilities as a teacher, so much as your diligence as a bureaucrat. There are other bizarre effects. Since Ofsted is now observing the college's self-assessment systems, there is an implicit incentive for the college to grade itself, and its teaching lower than it actually deserves. Correct. That's right. There's also a kind of postmodern capitalist version of Maoist confessionalism. Nice. So we've got market capitalism and market Stalinism and postmodern Maoism. It's great. In which workers are required to engage in constant symbolic self-denigration. Me and my housemate have been joking a lot recently about mandatory self-crit sessions. At one point, when our line manager was extolling the virtues of new light inspection system, he told us that the problem with our departmental logbooks was that they were not sufficiently self-critical. But don't worry, he urged. Any self-criticisms we make are purely symbolic and will never be acted upon. As if performing self-flagellation as part of a purely formal exercise in cynical bureaucratic compliance were any less demoralizing. Maybe. I guess it's kind of like the authoritarian dad thing I was saying before. It's like, you just have to write something down. Doesn't matter what it is. Like, I don't care. Just write something down. Versus the new one, which is like, you have to be really accurate and honest and critical of yourself, but also like, we would never dream of punishing you for it. Yeah. Haven't you just read this? I mean, in the post-Fordist classroom, the reflective... this is the bureaucracy chapter. Mental illness is coming up. These are his two fronts of attack, mental illness and bureaucracy. And now we're doing bureaucracy. In the post-Fordist classroom, the reflexive impotence of the students... Remember, he was talking about students who, like, must have earphones on even though nothing is playing. Couldn't be me. Is mirrored by the reflexive impotence of the teachers. DeAngelis and Harvey report the practices and requirements of standardization and surveillance obviously impose a huge burden of work on academics, and few are happy about it. There have been a number of responses. Managers have frequently suggested there is no alternative, Tina, and have perhaps suggested that what we need to do is work smarter, not harder. This seductive slogan, introduced to dampen staff resistance to further changes in our experience, has a devastating effect on working conditions. Attempts to couple the need for change in order to meet the budget pressures and increase competitiveness with staff's resistance not only worsening of their condition of work, with staff's resistance not only to worsening of their condition of work, but also to the educational and academic meaninglessness of the changes. No, they're not. They're also not meant to be read silently, IMO. They were just not meant to be read. This was a suicide note, or an attempt to argue himself out of suicide. The invocation of the idea that there is no alternative, and the recommendation to work smarter, not harder, shows how capitalist realism sets the tone for labor disputes in post-Fordism. Ending the inspection regime, one lecturer sardonically remarked, seems more impossible than ending slavery was. I mean, he has PhDs and was a teacher at several unis, so I reckon probably. Ending the inspection regime, one lecturer sardonically remarked, seemed even more impossible than ending slavery was. Such fatalism can only be challenged if a new collective political subject emerges. Nice, that's a nice prognosis. It's a pretty basic one in some levels. Sorry, just to respond to your issue, I think he's taking it as read that there's a value in it. And I think he thinks that the actual purpose is in learning and understanding, not in the functional outcomes of having a qualification, which the bureaucratic process is supported for. It's a very cynical view. I think maybe to an extent that's true. Yeah, I'm not sure though. I mean, just for example, well-educated people are more likely to vote conservative. Yeah, and whose purpose is that, though? And who is instituting it? And yeah. No, I mean, I like that blunt kind of cynicism. I get you two curves. It's all good. I like being provocatively cynical, and I think that there's a lot of value to it sometimes. And I think that's a legitimate... But I think that's more true of, like, high school and primary school than it is of tertiary education. But, yeah. There was something in here I wanted to look at, but I can't remember what it was. Yeah, kind of. But I think, being cynical is a language game, that, I don't know, yeah. Alright, I reckon I'm going to finish up there and do a raid, if there's anyone streaming. Nah, not really. Alright, I'm I'm going to finish up there. Thank you all for coming along. Yes, in Australia and in America, vast majority of Trump voters had tertiary education. Look, I'm willing to be proven wrong, but I think that is true.